There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter. 3 weeks before Elizabeth Day's 39th birthday, she had a really bad romantic breakup. It had been her first long-term relationship after her divorce, and she felt like a total failure when it ended. She was looking down the barrel of turning 40 as a single woman without the children she so desperately wanted. This was not how she thought her life was going to be. A couple of years earlier, she'd already blown things up a little bit by quitting her job as a journalist at the Observer newspaper. And kind of randomly, she decided to start a podcast called How to Fail, where she interviewed celebrities about their experiences of failure, to reassure herself and everyone about our own failures. But this interview isn't about failure, even though Elizabeth's podcast has become iconic. Today, we're talking about friendship and the fact that Elizabeth is addicted to it. She calls herself a friendaholic. She's written a book about it, and while that may sound like a non-problem, who can have too many friends? It very much is a problem, and you're about to hear why. My friendships underpin every aspect of my life. I don't think I could be married or be a mother or even do my job without my friends. But friendship comes with challenges. And Elizabeth points out that we have a whole vocabulary to explain and understand the ups and downs of romantic relationships, but friendships can also be really, really complicated, sometimes even more complicated than romantic relationships, especially when they end abruptly or go toxic or become one-sided or just fade. There's nothing more draining than clinging to a friendship with someone just because 20 years earlier you worked together or went to school together. Elizabeth said there's a big difference between being good at friendship and being a good friend. And in 2020, she realised she had a big problem. If you stick around, you'll also hear my conversation with Elizabeth about her hugely successful podcast, How to Fail, and why a recent essay that she wrote about fertility privilege sent me into a rage spiral. Enjoy this conversation with Elizabeth Day. I did. This story starts with the moment you realised you were a friendship addict. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, that was the starting point, not only for the book, but for my own journey of psychological self-discovery. And I think it came about because of the lockdown. So, as happened to almost everyone around the world, when the pandemic hit, our diaries emptied overnight. And when that happened to me, I was confronted by the truth of how I'd been spending my time. And I realized that I'd spent all of my time trying to meet the demands of people who I often liked but didn't know that well. They were people that I'd fallen into a kind of acquaintanceship with, who I might have met sitting next to at a work function, who I might have exchanged a few words with at yoga class. And suddenly I'd found myself in this dynamic where, for whatever reason, I felt that we should be friends, capital F friends. And what that meant was that I was trying to meet so many other demands that I wasn't spending enough time with the people who were the most nourishing to me. Actually, those people who are in my inner circle, who I am incredibly close to, who have known me for many years, and who would never place obligations on my time because they know how quote unquote busy I am. And I thought, well, there's something out of sorts there. And it felt like the equilibrium needed to be addressed. And that was the beginning of thinking about friendship and what it meant to me. And what I realized was that I was a friendaholic. It's a term that I have coined in order to denote exactly, as you say, an addiction to friendship, almost a codependent relationship with friendship. And what I mean by that is that at some point in my life, it became more important for me to be surrounded by people, to have a lot of what I would term friends, rather than to spend the appropriate amount of time building up my own sense of self-worth, or spending the appropriate amount of time focusing my energies and my love on a core group of people who were always going to have my back. And for me, the roots of that came from secondary school, when I grew up in Northern Ireland. I didn't have a great time at secondary school in Belfast. I was bullied. I felt very alone, isolated, scared. And when I changed schools, it became the most important thing in my head to make as many friends as possible. It didn't matter who they were. I was making no judgment call. I just needed to feel that I was accepted by a tribe of people bigger than myself. I maintain that mindset of thinking the most important thing is numbers, because I can't be left on my own. And actually, it became unsustainable. And I'm sure many of your listeners will relate to this, because when we try and spread ourselves so thinly so that we're trying to meet everyone's demands in our busy personal and professional lives, actually what that means is that you're not doing yourself a service, and you're not doing those other people a service, because you're not giving them your best self every time. You're just too exhausted to have the energy to turn up as your full self in every single scenario. So that is a brief summary of what I believe a friendaholic is.
You talk about Dunbar's number, and there are two numbers that I want you to explain. One is 5 and one is 150.
Yes. I'm so glad you asked me about Robin Dunbar, because I'm creepily obsessed with him. He's like the OG of friendship studies. He is a professor of evolutionary psychology at Oxford University, and I've never actually met him. We've had some close run-ins where we've been at similar events, but for whatever reason, the scheduling has never worked. And he famously coined what is now known as Dunbar's number quite a few years ago, and that's the 150 figure. And that is the number of connections that Dunbar believes the human brain can cope with, where you will know a salient fact about that individual's life, where you will be able to place them immediately. You know their name, you know something about their context. 150 is the number of people you would invite to a big wedding, for instance. And it's a number that is replicated again and again through history. So it's the average size, for instance, of a medieval village. It's the average size of a Christmas card list in the days when we all still sent Christmas cards on pieces of paper. And that's Dunbar's number. And that's an interesting number, because I think what I was doing when I was at the extremes of my friendship addiction was I kept trying to accumulate more and more people. And I have to say, when I say that, it sounds rather clinical, and it wasn't. These are all people that I liked and that I felt some sort of kindred connection with. But it was ultimately unsustainable, because Dunbar's number says, in order to have a meaningful connection and context for someone, the human brain can only really go up to 150. Now, a few years after that, Dunbar evolved this theory into Dunbar's layers, which is the idea that the 150 number still stands, but within that, there are different layers of friendship. And there are different layers of relationship that will mean something different and that will be able to meet different needs. And the innermost layer, he says, goes up to 5 key relationships. So that could be 5 really meaningful friendships. They are the ones that you will call at 4 a.m. when something goes wrong. They are the ones who will have your back, who think the best of you, who you can pick up with instantly where you left off, even if you haven't seen each other for a while. They are your closest friends. And they're the ones that need nurturing, and they're the ones that need the bulk of your time. And time is very important here, because there's been lots of other research done that shows it takes 200 hours at least to know someone to be able to call them a friend. And Dunbar says that if you have a meaningful romantic relationship, if you get married, if you have kids, that will generally cost you 2 of those key 5 relationships.
So you'll only have 3 left.
Yes, but you have outer layers. So in the second layer, it will go up to 10 friendships, and they're people who, you know, you might invite for dinner once every 3 months, but you're not necessarily speaking to them every single day. And that was a real light bulb moment for me, because I realized that I'd been trying so hard to be the quote unquote best, most perfect friend to everyone in my life, but I'd misunderstood the fundamental nature of friendship, which is that there are different kinds. And that actually, by spending too much of my time trying to meet the needs of those outer layers in the same way and to the same level as I was trying to meet the needs of the inner layer, I was doing a disservice to the people who were closest to me. So those are 2 Dunbar numbers that really helped my own thinking.
You talk about that sort of difference, almost the difference between the 2 numbers as the difference between being good at friendship where you might have dozens of friends, and being a good friend, which Dunbar says you can only really do with 5 people. And in terms of being a good friend, you know, the way the book works, and you interview different friends who have different roles in your life, and you speak to one friend who's an older friend called Joan, and she talks about the most important thing in friendship is reciprocity. Like, maybe not every day it's completely equal, but, you know, sometimes someone needs to lean in or some person isn't able to give as much. But when you've got that many friends, is it that they all want to be your friend, particularly since you've become successful and high profile and famous in the last few years? Have you found that you haven't evolved from thinking, oh, if this person wants to be my friend, I have to be their friend too because I got chosen?
What a great question. So many things to unpack there. First of all, you're so right to identify the difference between being a good friend and good at friendship. My best friend, Emma, describes it as there being a fundamental difference between being friendly to someone and actively wanting to pursue a friendship. Because part of the reason I wrote Friendaholic is because friendship is one of the most meaningful, sustaining loves of my life.
Same.
It has seen me through so much. I am so grateful to it and to my friends, and I wanted there to be a language to express how much it meant to me. But you have to give it your time and attention for that to be a reciprocal friendship. It absolutely requires a great deal of importance in your life. You need to create space for it. And so there has to be a difference between being friendly to someone in yoga class and actively pursuing such a meaningful friendship. And I think you have identified definitely an issue for me. There's a number of things going on for me, which one of them is that I, for whatever reason, have a fundamental lack of self-esteem. That is part of my life's work, is to sort of work out why that is. And I think if I can generalize a bit of gender, a lot of women possibly feel the same. Because if, like I did, you grew up in the 80s and 90s, we were conditioned in many ways to try and think about what other people wanted at the cost of what our own needs and desires were. And it became very difficult to understand, to name those needs and desires. And so I think I still am in a bit of that headspace, and I have to really check myself every single day with that, because there's part of me when I make a connection with someone, you're right, I feel the glow of that. I feel approved of.
Yeah, like I've been chosen. Yeah.
Exactly. And that really speaks, that really feeds that sort of people pleasing, I want to be nice and liked part of my conditioning. And also, I love connection. I should say that that's a wholly positive thing in my life. I love talking to people and asking them questions and getting to know them. But you're right that I've had to become more aware of where that can lead to, because friendship as a term is so broad, encompasses so much, that it also means it's diffuse. And the person that I'm having a connection with might have vastly different expectations of what friendship is from what I'm able to offer. So I think I've got a lot more honest with myself about the capacity I have to pursue any new friendship, and hopefully a lot more honest with the other person. And it doesn't have to be as clinical as saying, by the way, I only have 2 hours a week to give to this. It can literally just be setting non-verbal boundaries where you're not instantly going to reply to a text that they send you. You might leave it 24 hours. That in itself communicates something that is clear and worth communicating at the outset of any sort of platonic relationship. And that's very kind of you to say that I have grown in profile over the last few years. I have struggled claiming that because I don't want to sound like an egomaniac.
No, you're famous now.
I don't know if I am, but well, thank you for saying that. I don't. Why do I struggle with it so much? I think because it feels like fame is for other people. Fame is for Kate Blanchett. Fame is also something that, in my head, is quite two-dimensional. So you don't really know the person; you have an image of them. Whereas I feel that if anyone has ever engaged in my work, listened to a podcast, read a book, you do actually know me.
That's the problem, don't you think? Because with the parasocial relationship, like I don't think I'm friends with Sarah Jessica Parker, even though I've watched hundreds of hours of her on television. But with you, I feel like instantly I can talk to you and that I know you in a different way because I've listened to your podcast and because of that parasocial relationship, because podcasting in particular is a really intimate medium. So that must be something to adjust to, because people
Yeah.
not only would like to be friends with you, but they think they already are.
Yeah, it is something to adjust to, particularly for someone who is addicted to that adrenaline buzz of friendship. I think where I'm at with it is that I now understand so much more the difference between a connection that I make at a book signing, or if someone sends me a really beautiful Instagram DM, or I get forwarded an email because something I've written about fertility has really helped someone through their own journey. I now understand that that is a beautiful gift in and of its own right. And although I will try my best to reply to it, it doesn't have to be an ongoing relationship. And I think increasingly, because we're increasingly versed in social media, I'm very lucky that a lot of my listeners and readers and followers are understanding of that. And I'm very upfront about it and say, I'm really sorry, I can't reply to everything, but I do read them and it means so much to me. And I think there are a few things worse in this world than feeling unseen or ignored. And part of my role, I believe, is to try and make people feel seen, but that doesn't have to be a full-blown friendship every single time. And interestingly, if I can name drop for a second, because she's a total hero of mine, and I met her recently and I sat next to her at dinner, Elizabeth Gilbert, who I absolutely love and adore.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this because can you imagine, like, the amount of people, including me, the amount of people she has wanting her not only to be their life guru, but their best friend. And she said she'd been taught this thing by a spiritual teacher about how when you're having this sort of connected, beautiful conversation, this two-way exchange of affection and ideas, how she now says this thing in her head. She says, I appreciate your magic, but I don't need to take it on.
I love that.
I said to her, as she told me that, I was like, are you doing it right now? She was like, yes.
Yes.
And I've started doing that because actually I think just telling yourself that in your head is really helpful. And it's not just for people who have a profile, it's for anyone who struggles with boundaries. When you find yourself in a situation where you're at risk of blurring a boundary and you're at risk of saying yes to something that you don't necessarily feel wholeheartedly is a yes, if you just practice saying in your head, I appreciate what you're offering, but I can't take it on right now. I respect it, but it's not part of me. I find that's really helpful because it means that I remind myself not to overpromise and underdeliver.
Does it remind you a little bit of flirting? Like, I know that you're married and I am also, but there's a sort of a frisson that comes from the chemistry of a new friendship, like the energy of that can be really addictive because obviously you don't have that romantic flirtation with that person. But I find that I often fall into this a lot. Like if I've got chemistry with someone and I'm like, oh, we're going to be great friends. And then you just go, oh, no, I actually don't have time.
Yes. I think there are certain similarities, but where it differs for me is that flirting is ultimately a gameplay. And as someone who found herself a divorcee single in her late 30s and had to do a lot of online dating and a lot of banter in the old messaging apps, I got so sick of it because it felt like there was a dynamic at play always that was about one party withholding and the other party wanting more. And so I think that sometimes is what flirting involves when there's a romantic dynamic at play. Whereas with a platonic connection, it is literally that feeling of, I would love to know what you think about the world. And in hearing what you think about the world, increase my understanding of who we are. And I love that. I have innate curiosity. Some might call it rabid nosiness. I really want to know, with you now, I just want to know everything about your son and the fact that you're a grandmother and that your daughter-in-law gave you magpie. Like, I want to know where you grew up. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I think it's beautiful. And I love it when I find someone who is equally as engaged in that idea. And it's partly why I love reality TV, because it teaches me more about how humans interact. I think it's just that I've got a lot clearer about where that ends and where a true friendship starts. And the ones that now at the age of 44, I'm willing to invest precious time in.
Your best friend is Emma. She's a therapist, and you guys have a podcast together called Best Friend Therapy, which I also love. And I wanted to ask you about being best friends with a therapist, because the way you guys speak about each other is so beautiful. You know that she says that she doesn't think of you as a friend. She thinks of you as a life partner, even though you both have romantic life partners. But she's kind of like, you're the person that she does life alongside, which a lot of women will hear that and think, oh, I would love that, because not everybody does have that kind of friend. But I want to ask you about the challenges of being best friends with a therapist, because something that I've noticed can be really damaging in friendships, and a couple of friendships I've had have nearly run off the road at various times for me, where one of us starts playing therapist to the other and giving advice to the other. And it turns into, well, here's what you should do. How do you avoid that when your best friend is an actual therapist?
Oh, I've never been asked that before, and that's so interesting. I think she is a therapist, but to my mind, also the world's best therapist. She's so brilliant at what she does that the problem comes about in those sort of situations when, as you rightly say, your friend is playing a therapist rather than actually being one. And the best therapists don't proffer unasked for advice. And Emma is definitely one of those best therapists. Yeah. So I am in a dynamic with her where I genuinely, I seek her counsel. She's one of the two people, and she's probably the most important. It's Emma and my husband that I will go to for advice. If I'm really struggling with something, if I'm not sure about what decision to make, if I'm not sure how to communicate it, I'm extremely conflict avoidant. They're really good at helping me handle that. And I will always go and ask her, and then she will tell me what she thinks. And it's so unbelievably helpful, but it's always that way around. Emma would never therapize me unless I asked her to. And I feel incredibly blessed by this best friendship, because there's such a confluence of her knowing me so well, and also her having this extraordinary professional expertise to help me through life challenges when and if I need it. And if Emma does ever feel that she needs to step in, if, for instance, she feels that I'm unsafe, and that has happened in a past romantic relationship, and she did feel that she had to intervene, which was very uncharacteristic for her, she will always do it as a question. So she would always say, have you thought about this? Or how are you feeling about this? Rather than coming in saying, I think you should leave him because I think it's toxic. And actually, she's taught me so much, because I've gone wrong with that in the past. And actually, the one time that Emma and I had a mild falling out that neither of us ever want to speak about ever again, it was in our 20s, and she was in a toxic relationship. And I did do that intervention where I was trying to therapize her by giving her a statement of, you should leave. And I don't think that that's ever really appropriate. I think one of the key facets of meaningful friendship is the ability to listen non-judgmentally. And Emma utterly exemplifies that. Now, the only thing is, and she won't mind me saying this because we've laughed about it, when your best friend, or maybe you are in a romantic relationship with someone who is training to be a therapist. Now, when they're training, you have to be quite
They need to
careful.
practice on someone.
They need to practice. And quite often, Emma, not really with me, but with her husband would be like, oh, I forgot to put chili in the lasagna. And she'll be like, now, why do you think you did that? Do you think it was your upbringing?
Do you think that's a cry for help, not putting chili? Are you trying to be helpless?
I know, exactly.
Amina Artuso and her best friend, I've forgotten her last name.
Anne Friedman.
Oh, yes, that's embarrassing. Anne Friedman. I should remember. It's the same surname as me. They wrote a book about friendship called Big Friendship, and she talks about friendship stretching, how there are times in every friendship where you'll have to do small stretches. So maybe it might be that one friend is getting married and obsessed with her wedding, or another friend moves into state. But then there'll be like bigger stretches. So maybe one friend will become a Trump supporter, or they'll have a baby, or they experience something really difficult. She says that stretching can have a positive impact in terms of the resilience of your friendship. But what happens when something just stretches too far? Can you talk a little bit about Ella?
Yes, I am so glad you picked up on the idea of stretches, because it really helped me when I read that book, Big Friendship, which I highly recommend because they write it together. It's like written by a dual friendship, and I've never really read anything quite like it. And you're so right that there are some friendships that you do want to accommodate. And so you will stretch your muscle. And as you say, it can be positive because just like stretching your physical muscles, you end up having more capacity because you're willing to do that. But you're right that there are certain friendships that ultimately either of you will think, I don't know if it is worth stretching. I feel like I'm stretching to the point of my muscles snapping, and I feel that I'm doing more of the stretching or they're doing more of the stretching, and it's not reciprocal anymore in the way that it should be. And that can be for any number of reasons, as you identify. It can be one person having a baby and the other person struggling with fertility. And I've had that experience too. Or, as was the case with my friend Ella, finding yourself in a vastly different life phase and moving geographically far away from each other. And Ella is someone that I mention in the opening chapter of the book because it was part of the function of my reassessment of friendship during lockdown, was that I really evaluated the stretching that I was doing and whether all of the friendships in my life required or could accommodate continued stretching to that level. And Ella was one that couldn't. And it was for a number of reasons. It was that Ella and I had bonded in our 20s when she was so much fun, and we would go out and have lots of fun, capital letters, together, and we'd drink and we'd get up late, and we didn't have jobs that were that important at the time, and it was for a very specific phase in our lives. And then as we grew older, I knew that I wanted to try for a family, and I started doing a lot of fertility treatment, and Ella had never wanted children and she couldn't understand that. And that's absolutely fine. But at the same time as not being able to understand that, or I felt to make the kind of cognitive, empathetic leap to try or to ask me questions about it and to listen to what I was experiencing, she began to feel, I think, quite resentful that I wasn't available for her in exactly the same way that I had been in the past, as the fun friend who could go out and I've already mentioned the fact that I'm extremely conflict avoidant, and I think that makes me cowardly. And so for a long time, I wasn't being honest about the friction that I felt. And I was trying to do that thing of making communication slightly less frequent. And during lockdown, clearly Ella was undergoing her own reevaluation. And she, to her credit, I mean, there was a Facebook message involved, which I go into more detail in the book, that really I thought, oh no, I don't think there's any return from this. But she ended up sending me a text saying, I feel that there's a distance between us. What's up? I'd really like to know. And I'm so grateful that she did that. And it was very brave of her, because it meant that I felt safe being honest but loving in my response. And I replied saying, I think you're right. And I think that we're in different life phases, and it's nothing negative about who we are as people. It's simply that there's too much stretching involved to meet each other where we once did. And in the end, we carried on the conversation by text. And in the end, I said, I wish you nothing but love and all the happiness in the world. But I think we're in different places right now, and I have my own stuff, and I know that you have yours. And I send you love. And she reciprocated, and it's one of the most evolved things that has ever happened to me. And if I'm really honest, I actually, as a result of that, it sounds odd because Ella is no longer an active day-to-day friend in my life, but I feel closer to her. I feel that we know each other better because we created the space where we could be honest about that. And our friendship is in no way a failure. It's like we've protected the beautiful thing that it was, and that it might, in the fullness of time, become again in a different phase of our life. And I'm a huge advocate of the fact that a friendship ends or moves into a different evolution does not mean that you have failed, that it's a negative, because my relationship with Ella and my memory of her and the things that she taught me of life will forever shape how I live. And that's my way of still being in active dialogue with that friendship. And so that was the first time that I've had a friendship breakup where it felt that we were both grown up enough and evolved enough to be honest about it. And it was a really positive experience.
It's almost like you broke up and stay friends. Like, you know, that ex you still feel fondly towards.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always go that way. And you had a very
Definitely.
different experience with Becca, which just feels mortifying. And I'm so glad that you wrote about it, because often when we're ghosted by a friend, we never find out why, which is its own form of torture. But also, can you explain what happened and what you found out about why Becca ghosted you in the end?
Yes. So Becca, this is now going back a few years. So this was before Ella, before I was the highly evolved person that I now am. Just joking. But it was at a time when there was even less language around friendship than now. And Friendaholic, as I mentioned, is part of an attempt to correct that so that this doesn't ever need to happen again. But I was ghosted overnight by someone who I would have considered back then one of my 3 closest friends. And it was an incredibly shocking thing to happen. And it triggered a slow motion grief, the likes of which I have never experienced before or since. It's a very specific kind of grief, because you're right that when you're ghosted, someone drops out of your life, there is no explanation. And so you are left with your own narrative. And if you are someone who tends to veer towards self-criticism, who has lots of feelings of guilt, you end up thinking you must have been an awful, horrible person. And that's how I felt for a really long time. And what happened with Becca is that it was one of those friendships that I was too quick to fall into. So it's taught me a lot in that respect. I went through a phase in my 30s of going to spin classes and enjoying the pumping music and the adrenalized instructors. And I would always be skulking in the back row because I never wanted anyone to see me sweat absolute buckets onto the floor and fail to keep up with the tap back rhythm. But Becca came in one day and she was one of the people who wore the most incredible sort of leopard print 2-piece gym sets. And she clipped into the bike in the front row and could follow everything that the instructor was telling her to do. And she was just so impressive and charismatic from the first moment I laid eyes on her. And we bonded after that, and we kind of met in the shower queue afterwards. And then that turned into a coffee, and then that turned into cocktails. And then we were having dinners. And I was going through a really difficult time in my personal life. So I had been married, and my first marriage was in the process of imploding, although I didn't quite know it then. And Becca at that time was also in quite an unhappy place in her personal life. And so there was an immediate sense of bonding there. And I think that what happened is that we saw ourselves through a really difficult phase where we felt that our sadness was matched in each other's sadness.
Yes.
And so we became very close very quickly. And time moved on, and I got out of my first marriage and I became single, and I started dating, and I quit a job that hadn't been satisfying me, and things started going a little bit better professionally. And I moved into my own rented flat round the corner, by the way, from Becca, who'd suggested that. She was like, we can hang out all the time. And the hangouts never materialized, because I now realize that my life was moving on. And I still absolutely loved Becca and had loads of space for her, but I don't think that she was ready to move on from her own sadness, or couldn't. And therefore, being close with me was like holding a mirror up to something she didn't want to see reflected. And I think that was the start of this distance. So I would suggest meeting up for dinner and she would say, oh, can we make it a coffee instead? And it just became briefer and briefer until I got to the stage of thinking, I don't want to force her into something. Maybe she's going through her own stuff and I should give her space.
She's just not that into me.
Yeah, exactly. And I never heard from her again. And months after, when I was still giving her space, I remember walking out of the tube station where I lived and walking up the road to my flat. And Becca, so I should just say I've anonymized every single person in this book who belongs to my past. So I was walking up the street and I saw Becca on the other side of the road and I saw her seeing me. You know when someone clocks you.
Yep.
And our eyes briefly met and then she just turned away and carried on walking. And it was so shocking. I had been cut dead in the street. That was really my final verdict. I was like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Right.
She
Yeah.
does not want to be my friend anymore. And that was a very difficult thing to come to terms with. Many, many months after that, I met up with another former friend of hers who the same thing had happened to. And she said that Becca had felt suffocated by my closeness. And I could have a lot of sympathy for that looking back, because actually I did think Becca was amazing.
Did you want to die when you heard that?
Yes. It's awful, isn't it? And you look back, and I looked back and I was like, I see where she was coming from, because I respected her so much and I did want her advice and I did want to be like her and I did want to know where she got her clothes. And she was really generous and she was like, oh, you must go and see this osteopath and let me take you shopping because these boots would suit you. And she was like an older sister in so many ways for me. And because I was at that time insecure and flailing in the rest of my life, I think I probably latched onto that. And so I could understand from both perspectives what had happened. And that understanding has given me a lot of love and fondness for the friendship that we had, again, like Ella. And I've had to do that work myself because I haven't had someone to speak with about it and to work through it with. But I also understand that sometimes friendships can be so difficult and so nuanced and so complex. And sometimes you can love someone so much that you just can't communicate what it is because you know that it's going to hurt them. And sometimes it feels like the path of least resistance is just to drop out of their lives without a word. And so I have great sympathy for what she must have gone through. And I have now moved on with love from what happened to me. But I'm really glad I wrote that chapter because I knew that if I was going to tell the truth about friendship in this book, I also had to tell the things that were really uncomfortable for me, that didn't paint me in a particularly good life, but that were about my being honest about what this thing is, that we all value either because we have it in our lives or because we don't and because we're lonely and we want to understand more about it. And writing that chapter was really difficult, but it was also cathartic ultimately because I was able to put into words how I felt about it, and it gave me more of an insight into what I think was going on in Becca's mind. But the amazing thing about it has been the resonance it seems to have had with readers, because so many people have got in touch with me to say the same thing happened to them. And that's been really reassuring in one way, that it wasn't necessarily just me acting like an awful, suffocating person, that it's happened to lots of people, and it's because we don't have the language.
It's so common, like you just come in too hot and it's
Yeah.
like she came in too hot as well and then just went off reverse, which is what you've also felt with other people. So exactly, yeah. One of the things I appreciate about this book is that you say that we have so much language and mythology and narrative around explaining romantic relationships, but so little around friendships. You know, even the idea that a friendship could end is like, we expect our romantic relationships to end mostly, or we're certainly not that shocked when they do. We've all experienced that. But the idea that friendship should last forever, that's almost our default. And when they don't, it can be really confronting, can't it?
Exactly that. There is such an unrealistic expectation of platonic love. It's the idea that if you sit next to someone at primary school purely because you share the same first letter of your surname and you become friends, unless you are friends and remain friends for the rest of your joint lives, you have somehow failed. You are somehow a quote unquote bad friend. And you're absolutely right that we don't have that same expectation of romantic love. With romantic love, there is a belief, an assumption that you might have a high school sweetheart, but it's quite rare for that high school sweetheart to turn into your lifelong monogamous partner. That actually we expect ourselves to date, to try out relationships, to end them, to see what happens, even if we get married. As we know, 1 in 3 marriages end in divorce. And there is so much less moralizing, unless someone has behaved terribly badly. But there is generally less moralizing when a romantic relationship ends. We understand that that is part of growing apart, it's part of life's evolution. The same thing we should also understand about friendships. There are some friendships that will serve an amazing purpose for one part of your life, but it doesn't mean that you need to keep them going forever and ever and ever. And actually, it's unsustainable because you're not creating space to let new experiences or connections in, and you're not creating space to nurture the connections that are the really meaningful ones, that are governed by reciprocity and generosity. And I am so passionate about making that clear, and also making it clear that with romantic love, there's a whole set of social rituals that you can go through to show what your relationship is to each other, to the outside world. So you can have a wedding if you want. You can sign a piece of paper that shows your civil partners. You can move in together, buy a place together, have kids together. Even dating, the formula of dating, you have a first date, which is like a chemistry check. The second date, you might go for dinner. The third date, you might discuss your shared ambitions and goals. We don't have that for friendship. We think it's a bit cringe. And actually, it's so ironic because in a way, we have this misguided romantic principle about friendship, which is that you just connect and that's it then, and you're locked in forever. And we don't have it when we're looking for sort of actual romantic partners. But I've been doing a number of events around Friendaholic here in the UK. And at one of them in Bath, someone asked a question, and as part of the question said, I totally agree with you about romantic rituals. And the day before I got married to my now husband, I insisted on having a marriage to my best friend, where they went into the woods and they performed this, this beautiful commitment ceremony, which is not legally binding, but I just thought that was so wonderful because you talk about what you expect of each other and what you can promise to each other. And I'm a huge advocate of that. You don't need to go into the woods to do it, but just have the conversation.
I love that. I love that. Coming up, Elizabeth gives the best definition I think I've ever heard of a toxic friendship. And she talks about the very specific and often unspoken pain of a friendship breakup. Stick around. You talk about frenemies also, which I'm so glad that you have, because you've put words around something that a lot of people find very slippery. You describe your relationship with one of your own frenemies, a guy called Ali. And you describe frenemies as friendships that are so confusing you never quite know what you're going to get. They're the ones guaranteed to tell you a new haircut is interesting. Rather than giving a straightforward compliment, they're the ones who are secretly threatened by your success rather than rejoicing in it. They're the people who don't want to integrate you into their lives but will enjoy striking up intimate acquaintances with your other friends that exclude you. They will trigger feelings of uncertainty because they're capable of both love and withdrawal. They offer backhanded compliments and passive-aggressive jabs and never seem entirely capable of being happy for you. Oh, do you still have this in your life?
I do, but I have changed my response to it. And that's why I can still have individuals like that in my life. So what I mean by that is a lot of people can relate to this, that there are some people, and they're often very, very dear to you, who, for whatever reason, and very often it's to do with what's going on in their lives, can never be uncomplicatedly happy for someone else, but also can never offer a consistent kind of love. And so it is that sense of any time that you have an interaction with them, you are not quite sure what their reaction is going to be, how they're going to respond. but you still love them because they also have amazing qualities. And Ali, who I mentioned in the book, has so many amazing qualities. He can be so generous, and he can send me flowers out of the blue and just be so funny and charming to spend time with. And at his worst, he can also be passive aggressive and undermining. But what I realize about Ali is that it comes from his own insecurity. And actually, I found a way of loving him for that too.
That's big of you.
I mean, I'm making myself sound like the hero here, and I'm not by any means. I think I realized that if I didn't have Ali in my life, I would lose more than I'm currently losing. And I had a conversation with my husband about it. And he said, okay, you have 3 options here. You either stop being friends with Ali, or you stay being friends and it's the situation as it is, and you'll go out for dinner with him and you'll come back and you'll feel really drained and upset and you'll download to me about it. Or you treat Ali as a sort of charitable service. And what he meant by that was not that I'm some lady bountiful dispensing my tokens from on top of my moral high horse. What he meant by that was, can you concentrate on what your friendship might be bringing to Ali and exclusively try to focus your own energies on the positive things that Ali delivers? And that's a way of having a boundary in place that isn't cut and dried, where you've just decided, I've made the decision, I'll focus my energies here and not here. And I feel actually Ali's getting a lot out of this, and therefore I want to do that for him. So that's really helped in terms of recategorizing where that friendship lies for me. And it's a bit like Elizabeth Gilbert's magic cloak, because I go in with that sense of, I'm not going to give absolutely everything to every single complaint that he's got to download. It makes me feel better about it. However, there are also other people who were more extreme than Ali in terms of their friendship ambivalence, who I no longer have in my life because they really did sap my energy in an unhealthy way. And if anyone is listening to this and thinking, oh, but it's not that bad because sometimes they're nice, there's been a fascinating piece of research done by the University of Utah about ambivalent friendships, i.e. frenemies, where they got a number of participants to wear blood pressure monitors over the course of a few weeks. And they measured the blood pressure when those respondents had interactions with people they loved, people they actively hated, and ambivalent friends where they never really knew what they were going to get from the other person. And they found that the blood pressure was wholly unaffected if you were having an interaction with someone you loved, and sometimes it even went down. If you were having an interaction with someone you actively loathed, it also had no impact on your blood pressure because you were certain that you weren't going to like that person. They weren't going to give you what you needed. The ambivalent friends, they were the ones that caused a blood pressure spike because you were constantly having to recalibrate how you were according to what mood they were in any given day. And the same researchers went on to do future studies that showed that actually having too many ambivalent friendships negatively affects the formation of your DNA. It is actively bad for your physical health. And again, I found that quite liberating. I was like, okay, so that is a good reason for each individual to work out how many of those sorts of relationships they have capacity for in their lives, because they are and they can be bad for you.
I'm so glad that you spoke about that study because I've got a friend like that and I wouldn't think of her as a frenemy, but I like this idea of an ambivalent friend. She's so close to me and I adore her and I know she adores me, but she'll always just point out that I look tired or that I've got a pimple.
Yes.
Or that I've got dark circles. And it doesn't make me rageful, but it would spike my blood pressure because I'm just not ready for it. And I don't know how to respond to it. I mean, when someone says you look really tired, what are you meant to say?
Yeah.
So it catches you by surprise because you're in that vulnerable state because you love this person and then they just kind of jab you.
I'm not saying that this is what people should do at all. I once experimented, and I think a lot of people will relate to this in terms of family members too. But I once experimented with giving back exactly what I was getting in a single interaction from an ambivalent person in my life. and they would be saying, oh, you look tired. Oh, silver boots. Oh, I don't know if I'd wear silver boots. And I experimented with just doing the same to them in that moment. And they were wearing a purple top, and I was like, oh, purple, that's very brave of you to wear, just to see what would happen.
Oh, did it work? Did they stop?
And they didn't know. They stopped, but they also didn't know how to deal with it. They were like, well, I like purple. And I was like, and I like silver. And we just left it at that.
Oh, that's
No,
nice.
I'm not saying that's not an enlightened way to go about life, but it was quite interesting to me to see she didn't like it, this particular individual. And we just moved on because I felt like I'd made my point.
I love that so much. I kept the tape running after that because I wanted to talk to Elizabeth about all the ways her life changed so dramatically in her 40s, how she's dealt with fame and success at the same time in her life as she's been dealing with massive disappointment and pain around her fertility. Here's a taste.
At moments, I felt sheer panic, and I absolutely did feel a great deal of failure and shame, particularly over my marriage ending. But on the flip side of those spirals of panic, there was also massive opportunity, because for the first time in my life, I was presented with an entirely blank canvas.
You can listen to that second part of our conversation via the link in the show notes. This episode was produced by Cassie Merritt. The executive producer of No Filter is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Maddie Joannou. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll be in your ears next week.